Julian Assange may be the world's most famous journalist. He's also one of the world's most famous political prisoners. The founder of the whistleblowing journalism outlet WikiLeaks has essentially been a prisoner for 10 years. Starting in 2012, he was forced to go into protection in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And the United Nations later said that he was a victim of arbitrary detention by the British and Swedish governments, which were clearly trying to extradite him to the US. Washington plans on throwing Julian Assange in prison for the rest of his life. And in 2019, after for 7 years, Julian Assange was arbitrarily detained and was in asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, then the British authorities invaded the Ecuadorian embassy, which is Ecuadorian territory under international law, and arrested Julian Assange. And since 2019, he has been held in torturous conditions in a maximum security prison, Belmarsh Prison in London. And the United Nations top expert on torture has said that he's a victim of torture. Now, there has been a massive international grassroots movement with millions of people around the world demanding Julian Assange's freedom. And there have not been very many world leaders who have been willing to challenge the United States head on, criticize Washington and London for this political persecution of a journalist. However, there is one regional exception in the world, and that is Latin America, where the majority of the leaders of Latin America, including basically all of the major leftist leaders in Latin America who govern currently or recently governed the largest countries in Latin America, have all called for Julian Assange to be freed and have all criticized the United States and Britain for persecuting him and violating his rights and attacking freedom of the press and freedom of expression around the world. Because if the US can extradite Julian Assange, an Australian national, a foreigner, to the US and throw him in prison, he's facing 175 years of charges, so for the rest of his life. Then that would establish the worst possible precedent that says that the US government considers that it has the so-called right to imprison any journalist anywhere in the world, regardless of where they are, regardless of what their nationality is, if Washington doesn't like the facts that they report. If those journalists report and expose U.S. war crimes and other violations of international law committed by the U.S. government. So who are the leaders in Latin America who are calling for Julian Assange to be freed? Well, it's pretty much all of them. Brazil's president-elect and former president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, he has called for Julian Assange to be freed. Mexico's president, Andrés López Obrador, AMLO, he's called for Julian Assange to be freed. Those are the two largest countries. Argentina is the third largest, and the vice president and former president of Argentina, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, has also called for Julian Assange's freedom and criticized the politically motivated case against him. Furthermore, the new left-wing president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, has called for Julian Assange to be freed. The leftist president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, has very forcefully called for Julian Assange to be freed. In fact, Venezuela has been one of the most outspoken supporters of Julian Assange. Also, the revolutionary leftist president of Nicaragua, the ex-guerrilla and Sandinista leader, Daniel Ortega, has also called for Assange to be freed and condemned the fascism and racism of the US and other Western powers. The former leftist president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, is leading an international campaign to free Assange. The leftist former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, has also called for freeing Julian Assange. And then, of course, there's Ecuador. It was the socialist former president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who gave Julian Assange asylum in the first place, protecting Assange. And then Assange was later made an Ecuadorian citizen after Correa left, but he helped set the stage for that to happen. So, and Correa's successor, the leftist economist Andrés and presidential candidate, he has also praised Assange and called for him to be freed. So it's pretty much every leftist leader. The former leftist president of Paraguay, Fernando Lugo, who was overthrown in a US-backed soft coup in 2012, he has also called for freeing Julian Assange. And I should mention that Zelaya, the former Honduran president, he was overthrown in a US-backed coup in 2009. And Lula, who is also supporting the freedom for Assange, was likewise imprisoned in 2018 in a US-backed judicial coup. So, it's not a coincidence that these same leftist leaders in Latin America who criticize US imperialism and support Julian Assange have been targeted by the US for destabilization and coups and sanctions and propaganda, and the list goes on. So now that I've summarized all of those leaders, I just want to go through and look at some of the statements that they've made, because it's very impressive, and it shows that, excluding a few examples, the Chinese government has called for Julian Assange's freedom, the Russian government, the so-called official enemies of the US government. But excluding them, and then pretty much all of the Latin American left, I have seen very few comments from around the world from leaders calling for Julian Assange to be freed. It really shows that Latin America, as often is the case, is in the vanguard of the international movement, the struggle against imperialism. And Latin America is leading the international movement to free Julian Assange, a political prisoner of both the United States and Britain. Now, I want to look at a few things that I mentioned here, just briefly, because it's important to keep these facts in mind. And I should mention that I wrote an article about this over at multipolarista.com. I will link to it in the description below, and you can find links to everything that I discussed in this episode today. So that's where all the sources are. You can fact check me. I assure you that everything I say is 100% accurate and factual. So let me start with statements from the United Nations, because I think it's very important to look at what the United Nations, the leading authority in international law, has said about the arbitrary detention and torture of Julian Assange. It's very important to look at these statements because they're frequently ignored in mainstream corporate media. This is the official website of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. This is the top UN Human Rights Office. In 2019, the UN expert on torture, that is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, he said that Julian Assange is a victim of torture. Let me summarize some of the main points he released in 2019. So Nils Melzer, the UN top expert on torture, visited Assange in order to do a medical exam when, this is in April 2019, after Assange was imprisoned in Britain's maximum security Belmarsh prison. Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, he said he expressed alarm at the continued deterioration of Julian Assange's health since his arrest and detention, saying his life is now at risk. The top UN expert on torture said, quote, "While the US government prosecutes Mr. Assange for publishing information about serious human rights violations, including torture and murder, the officials responsible for these crimes continue to enjoy impunity." He's talking about the US government officials. So this is the top UN expert on torture condemning US hypocrisy. The UN Special Rapporteur said that Julian Assange showed, quote, "all the symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture," and the UN expert demanded immediate measures for Assange's protection of his health and dignity. So Julian Assange is a victim of torture. The top UN expert on torture has said that. It's not my opinion. It's the top UN expert. Now, that's not the only statement the UN has made acknowledging that Julian Assange is a victim, a political prisoner of these Western regimes. The UN Human Rights Office also, back in 2016, published another statement, and this is from the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detentions. And it deemed that Julian Assange was being deprived of liberty. And let me summarize a few points from this. This is the 2016 statement. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention said Mr. Julian Assange was arbitrarily detained by the governments of Sweden and the United Kingdom. They said Assange is entitled to his freedom of movement and to compensation. So he is a political prisoner. That statement from the United Nations was released in 2016, back when he was still in the Ecuadorian embassy. Because, like I said, the British and Swedish governments were trying to imprison him on bogus charges in order to extradite him to the United States. WikiLeaks had been saying that. Assange had been saying that again and again, repeating that at the time, in 2012 and later, and yet corporate media outlets and foreign governments in the US portrayed it as a crazy conspiracy, when obviously that's what they were planning all along, because that's what they're doing now. And again, Assange is facing 175 years in prison on completely ridiculous, bogus, politically motivated charges. Now, meanwhile, while Assange was being arbitrarily detained and stuck in the Ecuadorian embassy for 7 years, the CIA was spying on Julian Assange illegally. And not only that, the CIA was making plans to potentially kidnap Assange and kill him. They made plans to assassinate this journalist from WikiLeaks. It shows how much the US actually cares about freedom of the press and freedom of speech. It was making plans to murder the world's most famous journalist. This has been reported on by Yahoo News, a mainstream media outlet. It's also been reported by The Guardian, which is, Britain's establishment newspaper. So the fact that the CIA was planning to Assange is not an opinion, it is an objective fact. In fact, there is currently a court case going on in Spain about the illegal CIA spying on Julian Assange when he was in Ecuador's embassy in London. And why is that? Because the CIA was working through a Spanish security firm called UC Global, Undercover Global, that was founded and run by a Spanish military intelligence officer named David Morales. And he was working with the CIA, and because it was a Spanish company, and by the way, he had been hired by Ecuador's government to provide security for the Ecuadorian embassy, and they didn't know that he was spying on Assange on behalf of the CIA secretly. And so a Spanish judge has been looking into this case, and the judge has said that the CIA likely received illegally recorded conversations. And the CIA had video cameras all across the Ecuadorian embassy in London and was recording everything 24/7. And they even had microphones in the women's bathroom listening to all of Assange's private conversations, including with his lawyers, by the way, which violates clearly his civil liberties, his legal rights. In fact, it wasn't just Assange who was spied on. It was also journalists and other figures who met with Assange, and now they are suing the CIA. Prominent international journalists and lawyers are suing the CIA for violating their civil rights and spying on them when they were having their private conversations with Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, which is Ecuadorian sovereign territory. Even though it's in London, the space of the territory, according to international law, is Ecuador's sovereign territory inside that embassy. Now, I'm going to look at some of the statements from Latin American leaders. This takes me back to this article that I published at multipolarista.com. Again, the link is in the description below. It has all of the sources. Now, of course, I mentioned that it was the socialist former president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who is the one who gave Julian Assange asylum in the first place and has always been an outspoken supporter of Assange. So it's no-brainer. It's obvious that Correa supports Assange. But I also mentioned that the successor to Correa, who served as president from 2007 until 2017, his successor, a former minister and leftist economist, Andrés Arauz, has also expressed support for Assange. Arauz was the leftist presidential candidate in the 2021 elections in Ecuador, which he nearly won. He won the first round in a landslide, but he lost the second round. And he's been an outspoken supporter of Assange. And in 2021, Arauz tweeted, he said, real journalism and also Ecuadorian journalism is that of Julian Assange, praising Assange for his journalism and pointing out that Julian Assange was given Ecuadorian citizenship. So even though Assange is an Australian national, born in Australia, raised in Australia, he technically has Ecuadorian citizenship. Although the US-backed right-wing corrupt regime of Lenin Moreno in Ecuador that governed from 2017 until 2021, that US-backed corrupt authoritarian right-wing regime, it temporarily suspended Assange's Ecuadorian citizenship in violation of national Ecuadorian law and in violation of international law, which is the pretext that Britain used to arrest Assange. Now, the new president-elect of Brazil, Lula da Silva, who governed from 2003 until 2010, he's, of course, a leftist from the Workers' Party, one of the co-founders of the Workers' Party. He is also going to be returning to power in Brazil on January 1st, 2023. He won the presidential election against the far-right current leader, Jair Bolsonaro, on October 30th. And Lula da Silva has also expressed support for Julian Assange. In fact, on November 28th of this year, 2022, WikiLeaks sent their editor-in-chief and also their ambassador. Their editor-in-chief is named Kristen Hranson, and their ambassador, Joseph Farrell, they traveled to Brazil to meet with Lula. And Lula said that he sends his solidarity, and he expressed hope that, quote, Assange will be freed from his unjust imprisonment. So Brazil is, of course, the most populous country in Latin America. It's the largest country, and it has the biggest economy. So that's very major. Also, the new left-wing president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who's the first ever leftist president, has expressed support for Julian Assange as well. Just a week before the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, Hranson, and also the ambassador, Farrell, a week before they visited Brazil, they also went to Bogota, and they met with Colombia's president, Petro. And he said that he, quote, supports the worldwide struggle for the freedom of the journalist Julian Assange. And he also said that he's going to ask President Biden, the US president, to free Julian Assange, to drop the charges. And he said he's going to do that in collaboration with other leaders in Latin America. So we're seeing a campaign led by the leftist leaders in Latin America to free Julian Assange, collaborating with each other. Now, some of the most powerful statements in support of Assange have come from Nicaragua's president, Daniel Ortega, the revolutionary Sandinista, who led the Sandinista revolution in 1979 and then came back to power. And this is a Nicaraguan Sandinista media outlet that's called El 19 Digital. That's the 19th, which is the 19th of July, which is the date of the revolution, July 19th, 1979, the Sandinista revolution. And back in 2021, this major Sandinista media outlet, El 19 Digital, published an article that says, President Daniel, Assange won the Peace Prize of the peoples of the world. Ortega said, quote, Assange earned the recognition of the people, and for that he won the Peace Prize of the peoples of the world. And Ortega added, he did not win the Nobel Prize, which is given to those who destroy, invade, kill, and bomb. Ortega said that Assange's supposed crime, in scare quotes, was, quote, having denounced the violations of human rights, the crimes committed by the North American leaders in killings, in bombings. And he said that Western governments are authoritarian and they have their roots in racism, monarchism, and fascism. So very powerful statements from the president of Nicaragua. Also, the socialist president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, similarly has been an outspoken supporter of Julian Assange. In 2019, when Assange was imprisoned, the Venezuelan government published a press release harshly condemning the imprisonment of Assange and calling for him to be released. This is from the official Venezuelan government website, from the Ministry of People's Power for Foreign Relations. And in this statement, the Venezuelan government wrote that it was a, quote, atrocious decision and a, quote, shameful affront to international law and Assange's human rights. The Venezuelan government said Assange is a victim of political persecution and said his, quote, crime is having revealed to the world the darkest and most criminal face of the regime change wars that the U.S. empire executes, and in particular the massive killings of civilians and the shameful violation of human rights in Iraq. The Venezuelan government, President Maduro, also said, quote, the Australian Ecuadorian journalist should not be delivered to the U.S., where his life is in danger of a rigged judicial process, and, quote, where there clearly exists the intention to end his life. And then Venezuela stressed, quote, out of the respect of the right to asylum, out of the respect of international law, Julian Assange must be freed immediately. His life and its integrity must be protected and respected. So, like I said, of all the countries in the world, I would say that Venezuela, of all the governments in the world, Venezuela has probably been the most outspoken in defending Julian Assange and calling for him to be freed, with very powerful statements. And raising it at the United Nations, by the way. Now, Mexico's left-wing president, the first progressive leader of Mexico in over 40 years, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as the acronym AMLO, AMLO, he has repeatedly praised Julian Assange and called for him to be freed. And he said that Julian Assange is, quote, the best journalist of our time in the world. And he condemned U.S. government hypocrisy, which is incredible because Mexico, of course, is the southern neighbor of the U.S. They have a massive border. And Mexico and the U.S. are each other's country respective, their largest trading partner. And yet, López Obrador, the Mexican president, criticized the U.S. and he said that he called Assange rightfully a prisoner of conscience. And he asked, quote, are we going to take the Statue of Liberty out of New York? Are we going to keep talking about democracy? Are we going to keep talking about the protection of human rights, of the freedom of expression? And in a press conference, the Mexican president, AMLO, he actually showed a video clip of the collateral murder video, which was released by WikiLeaks, that shows the U.S. military killing journalists in Iraq from Reuters. The Mexican president played this video at a press conference. It's pretty incredible. So I mentioned the largest, most populous country in Latin America is Brazil. The second most populous country is Mexico. And President AMLO has been very outspoken in his praise of and defense of Julian Assange, calling for him to be freed repeatedly and recognizing him as a political prisoner. Now, the third largest economy in Latin America is in Argentina. And the former president of Argentina, who governed from 2007 until 2015, and now the current vice president, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, she has expressed support for Julian Assange as well. I mentioned that the editor of WikiLeaks, Ramfson, and also the ambassador, Joseph Farrell, they've been visiting Latin America, and they met with Argentina's Vice President Kirchner on December 5th. And back in 2019, when Assange was imprisoned, Kirchner tweeted, she said, in the upside-down world, fake news circulates freely, and those who reveal the truth are persecuted and imprisoned. She said that it's very important that citizens have the right to information, and she thanked Julian Assange for his work. And then in June of 2022, of this year, so while she was vice president, she tweeted this. She tweeted a screenshot of the Argentine newspaper Página 12 about the the extradition decision by the British court to extradite Assange to the U.S. And the screenshot of this Argentine newspaper says that it sends a chilling message to journalists of all of the world. And the Argentine vice president, Kirchner, she said, quote, "The decision to facilitate the extradition of Julian Assange not only puts his life at risk, but also marks an alarming precedent for all of the world's journalists who investigate and look for the truth. Journalistic disciplining for everyone." So saying that this is a threat for all journalists around the world. Now, Bolivia's socialist former president, Evo Morales, who was overthrown in a US-backed coup in 2019, he likewise has praised Julian Assange repeatedly. In response to the British decision to extradite Assange, he tweeted in June of this year, 2022, quote, "The decision of the United Kingdom to accept the request of the United States to extradite Julian Assange is a grave attack on journalism, on democracy, and on the search for truth." And then Evo Morales added that Assange, quote, "exposed the unpunished crimes of the empire. That is his only crime," in scare quotes. And then he sent, quote, "all our solidarity with him and his family." So another country in Latin America where the former president, Evo Morales of Bolivia, has expressed support for Assange. And last but not least, well, not even last, because I mentioned, Paraguay's president, Fernando Lula, and others. But in terms of the leaders who have been the most outspoken, you also have the former president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, who was overthrown in a US-backed coup in 2009. He is also currently an advisor to the president of Honduras right now, Xiomara Castro, who happens to be his wife. And Zelaya has been very outspoken in support of Julian Assange. And Zelaya, who is the founder and leader of Honduras's leftist party, which is called the Libre Party, he is the founder and president of an organization he created that is called the Anti-Imperialist People's International in defense of humanity and nature. And Zelaya actually has created an entire campaign advocating for freedom for Julian Assange. This is the Twitter account of the La Internacional Anti-Imperialista de los Pueblos, which was created by Manuel Zelaya. And they have an entire campaign on here that's hashtag Free Assange Now. And it features the leftist lawmaker from El Salvador's socialist FMLN party, a former guerrilla, Nidia Diaz. She has expressed support for Assange. It features a video from the Argentine socialist intellectual Atilio Boron expressing support for Assange and many other people. There's a video. So the point is that the leftist former president of Honduras has also launched a campaign praising Julian Assange. And he said, quote, "The world demands the immediate freedom of Julian Assange." And he sent a letter to British Prime Minister Liz Truss, who was Prime Minister very briefly, requesting that Britain reverse the decision to extradite Assange. And in 2020, Zelaya tweeted, he said, "Assange, for informing humanity about the hidden horrors of power, should be given an award." So those are the leftist leaders of Latin America who have called for Julian Assange to be freed. They're advocating for him, for his political rights. And according to the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, they're working together to create a pressure campaign demanding that the US government free Julian Assange and drop the bogus, politically motivated charges against him. So I think the entire world can learn from Latin America, not only in terms of trying to free Julian Assange and protect freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but also in how to fight for the people and how to create healthcare and education and social programs and resist capitalism and imperialism and neoliberalism. Latin America really is in the vanguard in the international struggle against imperialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, racism, in so many ways. And when it comes to their support for Julian Assange, the leftist leaders in the region keep showing, how brave they are and willing to challenge the massive global imperial hegemon in the United States, which constantly threatens them and imposes sanctions on them and tries to overthrow their governments. So with that, I'm going to conclude this analysis here today. I am Ben Norton. If you want to support this work that I do, you can go to multipolarista.com/support, and there are several ways to support. The best way is to go to patreon.com/multipolarista, and you can become a patron and help sustain my journalism and analysis. I am completely independent. I have no major donors or sponsors, so it's completely people-powered, this journalism and analysis here. And I want to thank everyone who watched or listened. If you're watching, please subscribe. If you're listening, also please subscribe to the podcasting platform. All my videos are released as podcasts, and all my podcasts are also videos. I'm Ben Norton. This is Multipolarista, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot.